as we were discussing earlier, we're talking about January 20th, 1986, obviously Space Shuttle Challenger. But before that, you had an interest in flying yourself, and this program came about. Tell me about that program and what piqued your interest.
Well, what really got me interested in space was all the way back to 1961 when Alan Shepard flew our first flight. And you think about the impact teachers have. Our first grade teacher brought in a TV set and we watched this launch. And I just got enamored with space and astronomy. And I wanted to be an astronaut, but my education path took me a little different way. Ended up going into education and teaching, still the sciences, but I really loved it. And then when President Reagan made the announcement that he wanted to fly a teacher to bring back the extraordinary opportunity to go into space, I thought, boy, that has my name written all over it. So I was one of 12,000 teachers that applied for that coveted position.
That's a lot of teachers who were interested and had that same dream of going into space. As the numbers began to whittle down and you realized that you were getting close, it must have been pretty exciting. Any reservations there?
You know what's funny about the reservation part? I'd been going down to the Cape for launches, covering launches for newspaper and for the planetarium and such as that for a number of years. And, you know, I had never seen a tragedy such as Challenger or Columbia later on because it seemed like the manned flights went without a hitch. Sometimes you'd have a scrub, but something wasn't running correctly, but it seemed like they always caught the problems. And I remember someone in the finalist group asking that question, are there any risks? And the NASA folks basically said, you know, no, they're not really any risk, otherwise we wouldn't be flying you. I think it took everybody by surprise. Maybe we became too cocky, too arrogant.
Did you believe that too? I mean, you thought, hey, of course there are no risks.
Well, you know, I'd seen these, what they call redundant sequence shutdowns on the pad, and I thought, you know, there's still risk. This is a spacecraft that are built by humans, and there's still those pieces that don't always work 100% like an automobile or an airplane, and, you know, there's still a risk. But I never thought it would be as catastrophic as Challenger.
So as you get to the finalists, you know, you get closer and closer to finding out who's going to be the actual, you become, you know, you get down to the 20 people who are left there. What did you have to do to qualify?
Well, the first thing, of course, is we did a significant application. And then there were a group of interviews. One of my interview team was Deke Slayton, who was the head of the astronauts for a number of years, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. And so we sat down and had this very casual conversation, yet it was in the form of an interview. And Deke would ask you questions like, you know, why do you want to fly aboard the shuttle? What makes you think you've got the right stuff? What fears do you have? And believe it or not, the wrong answer about fears is saying, I'm fearless. You shouldn't have any fears whatsoever. It was more of, you know, you need to be cautious, you need to be careful. And he related to me later on, he said, even us, the right stuff astronauts from the original Mercury 7, each of us had our little qualms and concerns about space flight, yet we knew it was part of the job we had to do.
So I imagine, take me to that day where you found out that you had been eliminated out of the finalist pool.
Very disappointed. I really wanted to fly. And it was one of those reactions, literally, where it's like, God, don't you know the desires of my heart? I really want to fly the space shuttle, and here I'm cut out altogether. And I really was, I won't say distraught, disappointed. I know I had a lot of my students and teachers at Fletcher High School that were so supportive. I kind of felt like I'd let them down too. And then, of course, 6 months later, Challenger blows up. And, you know, you look in retrospect and, you know, it's one of these things that you say, you know, if not for the grace of God, you know, maybe I would have been aboard that orbiter.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry. Did you, even though you were disqualified from that pool of potentials, you still went. Was that tough for you to go, or did you watch it and you're like, man, I should be on that shuttle right now?
You know, it's interesting that NASA had the finalists at the Cape a week before leading up to the Challenger launch. And some of the words out of headquarters was that they were so happy with the Teacher in Space program that they were going to continue it, that there were going to be more than one teacher would fly. There was some conversation about flying Barbara Morgan, who was Krista's backup, on what would have been the Hubble Space Telescope launch in October of 1986. And so there may have still been a chance that some of us would have had that opportunity to fly. Then when we gathered, and I still remember, gathering the morning of Challenger's launch, and it never really struck me that I wasn't aboard that orbiter. It was so cold, but I think we were all so supportive of not just Challenger's last crew, but of Krista, and wanted Krista to have such a successful mission that really didn't really flash through my mind, dang it, that should have been me. It was more of being supportive for the mission and the operations that were going to happen and the experiments and demonstrations she'd do on orbit and bringing space back to students. That's what was important.
Did you ever meet her?
I didn't meet her. In fact, I met her before she was selected. We got to know each other quite well, all the teachers in space, in that we did a variety of activities and meetings and training together. And so before Krista was even selected, I got to know her. Very passionate about history, a very good teacher, very bubbly, and would have done a wonderful job on orbit teaching students.
Bitterly cold morning. You're there outside, I imagine?
Outside.
Outside. Where were you?
At the Kennedy Space Center.
The Space Center, one of those viewing areas?
Yes, they had the teachers set up right next to the press site.
Okay.
So, that's the 3 mile away mark.
Lunch goes fine. Take me to thoughts and just walk me through what happened after 83 seconds or 76 seconds.
Well, it's interesting that, again, I'd been down there and experienced launches before. And so I was very familiar with some of those milestones, pre-launch, launch, go with throttle up, SRB, solid rocket booster separation, and then finally on into orbit. And so we heard the call for go for throttle up. And at that instant, there was this kind of nasty, like fog-like cloud that surrounded where the orbiter and the solids had been. And then you suddenly saw two pencil-like shapes come out of that cloud. And my first thought was that something had gone wrong and they had detached the two solid rocket boosters, and Challenger would drop out of that cloud, circle back around, and land at the Kennedy Space Center's remote runway. And of course, after 15, 20 seconds, there was no orbiter. And I think it was so surreal, it took probably a good minute for even someone like myself, who was familiar with launches and what happened, to really sink in what had happened.
When did it sink in that all seven aboard had passed away?
I think that it really didn't sink in that we had lost the entire crew until maybe an hour after, because you always had the hope that the compartment itself would have separated, that there had been, maybe we just didn't see the orbiter come through, those sort of things. And it was truly, probably for me, I'd say an hour, but probably less, because as I think back and realizing that you'd had an explosion and the chances of recovering the shuttle or part of the orbiter or the crew compartment would be minimal. It really didn't sink in for about an hour, but probably pretty quickly.
Was there a lot of open crying and as people were there, that you recall the mood or the emotion of the moment?
There wasn't initially. I think people were so much in shock at what had happened, because it was an anomaly like we in the United States had never seen with a manned space flight before. Remember, the only true tragedy we had had was the Apollo 1 fire. And that was in 1967, where you had the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts who were just doing a checkout of their spacecraft. And all of a sudden there was a flash fire, and all 3 were killed on the pad just doing a test run through of launch. And so we had never seen a catastrophic failure of a manned launch before. And so I think it was mostly people's reaction initially was that of disbelief that it couldn't have happened, that there'd still be an orbiter had come down, those sorts of reactions. They'd still find the crew. I think it was just initially, and then some people, it really sunk in. Some people did break down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you think about Krista?
I thought about the entire crew. I thought about Krista. I thought about her family. And, it's interesting because following the accident, we got very close to a couple of the families. I got to know June Scobie Rogers quite well as she did her work for the Challenger Learning Center. A dear, precious woman who really continued with the whole mission of Challenger. Also became very close to Greg Jarvis's dad and stepmom, Bruce and Ellen. And talking to them, they lived here in Florida, talking to them and doing some work with them, they would talk about Greg and his aspirations and wanting to fly aboard the orbiter. And you can just see the broken heart of a father who dearly loved his son and loved what his son had accomplished, yet the pain of losing his son.
Well, time goes on. We realize there were some warnings that took place. They never should have launched that day. What were your thoughts on, now when you, and then, about the fact that they were warned it's too cold?
Well, I actually attended the press conference the day before. Challenger was on the pad, fueled, and they were having problems closing the door. The issue was they couldn't get the driver to actually work, and so they decided to scrub. And so at the press conference, following the scrub for that day on the 27th of January, they were asked immediately, are you really going to try to fly tomorrow? Because the weather's supposed to be unseasonably cold. And the NASA folks just kind of seemed to, in a sense, kind of laugh it off. And in fact, someone made the comment, we don't usually fly unmanned rockets at that low of temperature, nonetheless manned rockets. But we'll probably go through the countdown and, just see if, it does warm up a bit where we can fly. And that morning, because NASA had these monitors set up at the press site and with the teachers in space, they kept on showing these videos from the pad which showed these huge icicles hanging off the orbiter. And everybody kept on saying, you're really not going to try to fly, are you? So I think everybody was stunned. And of course, we didn't know about the warnings that had gone on behind the scenes. I think everybody was stunned when they picked up the count and they launched.
How did that whole event, the tragedy, affect you personally as a person, knowing that could have been you?
Well, I think there were a couple of ways it affected me. One was knowing that every day here on Earth is a gift. And so use that time wisely and, stick to your mission, your God-given gifts. And that's probably one of the reasons that, I love education so much and have stayed in education, and that I feel a part of what I can do is give back by just trying to excite people about astronomy and space and the sciences. The other thing is I think it really made me more appreciative, not that I wasn't, but more appreciative of my family. So I remember talking to my mom, who's since passed away, maybe about 6 months after the Challenger accident. And I was making some comment about how I really still want to fly. She said, I'd really still love to fly if I could. And I looked at her face, which I had not done before, and I saw this look that I remember to the day. And I said, does that bother you? And she says, Michael, that scares me to death. How do we know that that's not going to happen again? And I had never thought about how that impacted my wife, my 2 children, my mother, my brother, my sister, my family. And it really had an effect on them too. Mm-hmm. So becoming more aware of those who are around you and how these sort of events affect their lives too. It can be nice and brave to say, hey, I still want to fly in space, but to be sensitive to the family and their concerns And you know, the chances that another accident happened turned out to be pretty good, and it did with Columbia. So, you know, again, it's just one of those things that you learn some of those lessons, very deep lessons.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone's glad you stayed on the ground. Yeah. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Anything else you want to add, or?
No, it's hard to believe it's been 30 years.
Yeah, we look back on 30 years, and I mean, time has flown by. So much has changed. That technology's outdated.
It
Now
is.
we're going to Mars, possibly.
I know. It's amazing how the technology has changed. That's what I tell my astronomy students. I talk about how the technology has changed since, we're not just talking about since Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. We're talking about since the shuttle. In fact, we were talking today about the Falcon 9 landing that booster back at Cape Canaveral. I mean, that's science fiction.
Coming
Yet
right back down.
coming right back down. We're doing that stuff. It's like, man, this is crazy.
Yeah.
But technology and time marches on.